My sister Amy and I were raised in a tiny seaside town in the north of England. Beautiful to the tourist eye, but relentlessly dull to the pair of teenagers who'd traipsed around the arcade and the gray stretch of beach so many times that we could have walked it blind. The sole activity that still mustered any particular excitement for us was what the local youths had dubbed the Eely cave game, being that it took place in said cavern situated in an elusive cove, accessible only by descending a hazardous ledge of cliff face. And the sea currents around it were too strong for us to have swum there and back, so climb we did. Loose stones and scarce handholds in the rock meant you had to crawl on your belly, gecko-like, naively hoping that any climber behind you would break a potential fall. There must have been more than a few broken bones amongst the participants from that stage alone, but Amy and I always emerged unscathed, though somewhat out of breath and streaked with mud and sand from the slope. Once a player arrived at Eely Cave, the goal was to uncover a tunnel through the wall which could be unlocked only by following one or more of the game's many nebulous rules. These ranged from a standard rhythm of knocking on the stone to reciting a song aloud, the latter of which had largely fallen out of favor by the time our generation had started to play. No one we knew had ever been successful, but there were young people who'd gone missing across previous decades who were considered by our peers to have won. The rumor of the hidden gateway had begun somewhere after all. The question was what it all lead to and why those victorious players had never returned. Like the journey to the cave itself, the implications of those historical vanishings failed to dissuade my sister and I from trying to uncover its secrets. At least once a week, we'd climb down into the cavern and stand side by side, knocking our fists along the damp walls in the hope of finding some hidden lock or breaking some spell. What the elusive tunnel was and how it had been hidden from sight was little agreed upon amongst the players. Some of our friends thought it was a man-made construction, a war bunker or treasure trove. Others had the idea that it was paranormal and that it led into the roots of some other world. Then there was the faction that didn't really believe in anything, playing with the indifferent apathy of young people with nothing else to do. Amy and I often pretended to belong to this group, cracking cynical jokes even as we brought our fists to the walls of the cavern, unable to deny our superstitions. We both knew even then that one of us would win the game without comprehending where that knowing had come from, nor which of us it referred to. So we went back and back to Eely Cave until the day Amy won. Our parents were out, I remember, and with school finished for the summer, my sister and I were at liberty to do whatever we wanted. Predictably, we found ourselves tortured by the usual boredom. The arcades were humid and jostling with families and bickering teenagers, the beach listless with rain. Without needing to discuss it, the decision was made to visit the cove and play the Eely cave game for the second time that week. With much grunting and swearing, we clambered down the muddy verge of cliff, kicking clods of dirt at each other only half by accident. The sea lashed at the sand like a white rope, and the air felt heavy over us as we ducked into the shelter of the cave. It was only as large within as the average classroom, the roof low enough to touch if we jumped and clapped our hands to it. The names of 1,000 children had been carved into the rock on all sides, and there were empty drinks cans and cigarette butts on the ground underfoot left behind by less reverential players. "Scruffs," said Amy, kicking at the litter. She didn't like the idea of those casually engaged in the game stumbling upon the Eely tunnel before us. "So what are we doing this time?" I asked, referring to the system of knocks we'd try on various parts of the walls. "Last time we did 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 1. No point doing it again, is there?" The common belief was that a rhythm of 8 beats was required to open the gateway. What remained unsure was how precisely they should be delivered. "I don't know," said Amy. I thought maybe we could do 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, like a heartbeat, and just work our way round in a circle. We could try 2 different patterns and get more done, I suggested. Amy shook her head. Last time we did that, I messed mine up. It proper distracts me when you're not doing the same one as me. I rubbed my hands together, surprised by how cool the cave remained despite the heat beyond its entrance. Are we doing the song this time? Amy rolled her eyes. You can do it. I always feel like a right knobhead. That's because you're a knobhead. Piss off. I grinned. Amy always became snappy when she was nervous, and I could almost see the dark coils of her hair stand on end. Well, you don't even have to sing it, I pointed out. You can just say it. It's a song, though. That's the whole point. If you don't sing, then it won't work, will it? To be fair, we don't even know if it even does or if someone just made it up. Might as well throw a dance in and see if that works as well. In a sudden burst of irritation, Amy pushed my shoulder and stalked off to the other side of the cave. You're doing my head in now. Just do the knocks, all right? At this, we both became serious and began working our way slowly around the walls. Our phone torches lit up in our free hands as we wrapped our fists from floor to ceiling as far as we could reach. For some time, there was only the sound of our breathing, the crunch of sand under our shoes, and our knuckle bones against the rock. I heard Amy begin to sing quietly, half under her breath, her mouth almost touching the stone. Eely cave, oh black, oh dark, open up the night, you are. As juvenile as the lyrics were, she had a strong voice and had been in the school choir before she got older and embarrassed of it, mainly due to my brotherly torments. That Amy was singing in my presence proved how desperate she was to be that decade's winner, to uncover the doorway that no competitor, to our knowledge, had. I didn't laugh. Couldn't when I felt that same urge to succeed. Our voices cracked as we counted out the knocks or uttered the words of that childish rhyme to the walls. Something came over us there in the cave, a crawling apprehension that we hadn't known there before. The fun had ended, and suddenly I was experiencing the same fear I felt running from the bathroom to my bed at night, thinking something would jump out at me from the shade of the stairwell. Amy, I said, let's go, we've lost. We can come back next week. She didn't hear me, for though no longer singing, she muttered under her breath and knocked the wall so fiercely that I saw beads of blood left on the stone. Ames, I said, stop it, will you? She turned her head to snap at me, but before she could speak, her right fist fell through the wall ahead of her. Not into a pocket in the rock, but into a stretch of darkness I had not perceived there till she touched it. It wasn't a hole or a door or a tunnel in any conventional use of the word, but a black matter that ate 6 feet of stone and let in no light, though Amy's phone was directed right at it. Her arm had been taken by it to the elbow, and it seemed that something had hold of her within it, for as she turned to face the void, her entire body pitched forwards, unbalanced. Amy fell with a scream that vanished without echo, as though the black had taken the sound into itself as well. I lunged for her, grabbing at the back of her shirt, but just as my fingers pinched the cotton, I found myself faced with firm rock again, the shred of fabric trapped within it hanging like a growth of moss. My sister's phone had fallen from her pocket, lying smashed at my feet, the battery ejected from its back. I stood still, gripping onto the rag of Amy's t-shirt, staring aghast at the closed door of the wall. Then I began to scream, incoherent yells of horror and grief and rage that my sister had been taken from me, that I had not been allowed to follow. I started to beat my hands against the cavern, struck and struck at the rock until the skin split across the heels of my hands. I begged to be let in for her to be let out, tried to remember the pattern of knocks that had allowed Amy to enter the wall. but it did not once yield. For an hour I stood there, taunted by the quiet and the dark, until at last I staggered out of the cave and clawed my way back up the cliff with barely any understanding of what I did. All I saw and heard was Amy, her cry as the darkness took her in, the pain that surely seized her as she fell. Striped with mud and sand, I stumbled home, the shock that closed over me so profound that I barely noticed my parents' car pulling into the driveway behind me. Only when my mother got out to shake me by the shoulder did my gaze focus on their faces, both of them tense with alarm. I said, "She's gone, she's gone." Then I screamed again and couldn't stop until my throat gave out and shattered the sound. My parents half dragged me into the kitchen, forcing me to sit at the table even as I struggled against their arms. Having grown up in the town, they'd heard of the Eely cave game and had even played it themselves in their youth. But in adulthood, they no longer believed in it, and as in choked pieces I described how Amy had vanished, I saw the anger and bewilderment of that doubt cloud their eyes. I'd later learned that they thought my sister must have fallen from the cliff and broken her neck, or else attempted to swim against a violent current and drowned. They believed that I lied then through the guilt that I'd had some part in her death, or because the sight of it was so unbearable that I'd rather pretend the cave had swallowed her than admit the reality of what I'd seen. The police were called, forcing me through another interview that exhausted me to the point I could no longer form coherent speech. A search was conducted around the cove with the expectation of finding a body or some evidence of an accident, but being that none was discovered, I was interviewed a second time, this time with the implication that I had harmed Amy in some way, or had concealed her having run away from home. In the end, they could find no proof of that either, succeeding in nothing but reducing me to hysterics. My mother and father, though still privately convinced of my guilt, defended me against the rumors that arose from her disappearance. They campaigned endlessly in the news and with posters and radio interviews, offering a reward to anyone that came out with information as to where Amy had gone. Their efforts consumed them to the point that they both lost weight, wandering about the town, flyers in hand, like two lone survivors of famine. In time, they grew distant from me, a gully which later deepened into resentment when I was suspended from school after fighting with another pupil, Sam Rowe, between classes. "Heard your sister won the Eely cave game," he'd said, shuffling after me down a busy corridor. "How did she do it?" He hadn't been the first to ask, but the others who'd done so quickly backed off when they'd seen the look in my eyes. Sam, however, kept pushing, following me even as I attempted to lose him in the knots of students between us. "You know what, I bet you're full of it," he scoffed. "Bet you didn't go anywhere near it." "Yeah?" I snapped. "So where's my sister then?" Sam shrugged, his greasy face sly with malice. "Probably run off with some lad. Everyone knows what she's like." I'd turned and hit his sneering mouth with the same blind anger with which I'd struck at the cavern, and only our peers yanking us apart prevented me from knocking Sam's teeth down his throat. In the weeks following that incident, barred from the school gates, I entered a daze that never quite ended, drifting between Eely Cave and the house in which I felt unwanted, waiting for Amy's return or some definite sign of her end that I knew was unlikely to come. Sometimes, as I ran my hands across the rough walls of the cavern, I thought I heard my sister's screams or snatches of her voice in song, straining my ears at the dark until I lost the trace of them again. There were days that I convinced myself that there were other voices too, and I would stand and listen to them till nightfall, mesmerized by dread, though perhaps it was only the sea I heard against the rocks or the gulls wailing overhead. But I never believed that, for the horror of Amy's loss prevented me from perceiving the sound as anything but the cries of the many children that had fallen through the stone. I continued my habitual back and forth from house to cove incessantly, giving it up only when, in my late teens, my mother became ill with a heart condition. My father had fallen into such a profound depression that he couldn't be expected to look after her, and so my life became for them, and them alone. I didn't mind it, for by then I'd come to blame myself for Amy's vanishing completely. I should have played without her, I'd tell myself, driven her off with a scathing word or shove. Over time, I'd forgotten how close we were and how pig-headed Amy had been. With or without me, she would have been a competitor in the game, and it was only my bad luck that I'd been present to see her digested by the cave. My mother died when I was 20. My father could barely look at me when we buried her. He passed some months after from a sudden aneurysm, and though I'd been alone since Amy had disappeared, I truly felt it then, trapped in the corpse that was our home. I was resigned to that loneliness, certain that I was deserving of it. The following summer, a knock came at the front door in the night. I lay in bed listening to it without any intention of getting up to answer, my head pulsing from the remains of a hangover. Like my late father, I drank. I rarely received visitors, was unemployed, and had a few friends left by then, if any at all. Someone had likely gone to the wrong house, I thought. They'd go away soon and I could sleep. Only when the knocking started on the windows did I stumble down the dark stairway to the front door, fumbling to unlock it and tug it clumsily open. A small girl stared up at me from under a tangle of dripping hair, sand smeared across her face like a half mask, one skinny arm shielding her eyes from the rain. She couldn't have been more than 16, and yet she held herself delicately, as though she were very old or ill. I knew her. She was my sister. But it was so impossible for her to be there and almost entirely unchanged that I looked at her as though she were a stranger, my arm across the door to prevent her from entering the house. I was afraid of her, of course, for I did not know what she was. "Are you not going to let me in then?" said Amy, and her voice was the same, though dull and dry. "No," I said. "You're not Amy, you can't be. You're still in Eely Cave, you're dead. I saw it." She shook her head and her eyes were lifeless, the brown of them gone to black. "It let me go," she said. "The people who won the game before me, they're all in there still." I felt a weakness come over me and gripped onto the door in case I fell. "I don't know what you're on about," I mumbled. "What are you—" "Just let me in and I'll tell you." Not knowing what else to do, I stepped back into the house and Amy followed. She was wearing the same pink t-shirt she'd worn on the day we'd played the Eely Cave game, a chunk ripped from the back where it had been trapped in the wall. I'd gone insane with grief, I thought, or the drink had summoned a ghost. But as Amy moved past me into the kitchen, her arm brushed mine and it was warm, the heat of the living. I was glad to sit down, so lightheaded with shock that I was surprised to still be on my feet. Amy looked at me and I looked back. Neither of us spoke for some time. Then I said, "So what is that thing in Eely Cave? The hole you fell into?" "Alive," she said simply. I let out a hysterical laugh. "How can a cave be alive?" "Because it just looks like one, but it's not. I think it's a monster. Some of the players inside it called it that. And the game we've all been playing, it's all pointless. It doesn't even matter. It just chooses people to let in when it feels like it." I studied Amy's face, which was serious in a way she'd never been as a child except inside Eely Cave. "So how do you know it chooses people?" I asked. "Because it told us," said Amy. "We could all hear its voice in our heads. Like if darkness had a sound, I swear that's what it was like. The Eely." I rubbed my face, finding it damp with a sudden sweat. "When it took me inside it, I could hear other kids screaming and shouting," said Amy. Felt them all around me, pushing and shoving and all desperate to get out. But nobody had ever got out before. They only ever went in and just stayed there. Never got any older, like it was preserving us or something. Not that we could see each other to tell. Like I said, it was all black. So black and dark and cold as well. My sister leant her head upon her arms, and I wished that I had the courage to get up from my seat and hold her. But I'd never been that kind of brother, and though she'd come back to me, we were still, in a way, far apart. I was in their years, wasn't I? Said Amy suddenly. It felt like even longer. Ages and ages. All of them other kids that had played the game thinking it was a fun joke. All of them were just crying and shouting, knowing they were never getting out of the Eely. But I don't think any of them actually knew how long they'd been in the dark. I used to hear them, I said. In the cave I heard them all the time. I thought I was making it up. Amy didn't answer, only drew spirals on the table with her finger. A habit she'd had as a girl and had held on to even through all those years in that timeless sentient hallway. Do you know what the Eely was keeping you there for? I asked. Yeah, said Amy flatly. It was eating us. Not our bodies, the inside of our heads. Them kids were all going senile. You could tell when the Eely was done with someone when they'd just go quiet. They'd forget how to talk and who they were. That was worse than all the screaming because they wouldn't die. They'd just be like that forever in there and nobody outside would ever know what happened to them. An endless lifetime without light, slowly devoured by a vast concourse of evil. I ran a hand across my clammy forehead as though to brush the thought out. So how did you get away from the Eely? I asked. How are you even here? Amy glanced up at me and her eyes were like grave dirt, full of a death that never was. It let me go. It knew you'd seen it take me, so it kept me for as long as it did, knowing you were on the other side, waiting, thinking you'd lost me. Then one day I saw a light coming into the Eely. I was the only one of the kids there that could. I went towards it, walked and walked through the black until I was in the cave again. I thought it was a trick at first. I was too scared to go anywhere. But then it got dark again, a real night for the first time in so long. I climbed up the cliff and walked all the way here. But the whole time I knew the only reason I was out of the dark was because it wanted you to see me. Why though? I pressed her. Why would it do that? So I could tell you what was at the end of the game, she said. What it was doing in there so it could laugh at you. It knows that no one's going to believe you, Jake. She laid her head on her arms again, and looking at her, I wondered how much of her mind had been consumed during her 11 years in the dark. How much was left of her perhaps even she did not know. Kids are still going to play the Eely Cave game, said Amy. They'll play no matter what you say or what you do.